Hey folks, welcome to English 261, week 10. This week what I'm going to do is I'm going to go through the second bunch of the modernist poets, and they're not technically all modernists. They come from some different movements, so there's some lyric poets in there. But generally speaking, when we talk about modernist poets, it's kind of interchangeable for the poets who are actually technically modernists according to the actual movement, but also to some extent. So we're kind of looking to 20th century poets. We're kind of looking at modernist and modern poets in the bunch here this week. So that's kind of what we'll be working on, taking a look at as we go here. So generally speaking, before I dig into the actual reading for this week, what I'd like you to do is this week you need to read selections for week 10. You need to go ahead and critique the sonics, and you need to finish and submit Poetry Bundle 2 by Sunday 11:59 p.m. And you also need to submit your blank verse project by Sunday 11:59 p.m. I did update the blank verse project when I went to check on it. It seemed that I had, in the prior semester, confused blank verse and free verse. Blank verse is poetry that does not have a particular rhyme scheme nor a particular stanza structure, but it is written in pentameter, ideally iambic pentameter. So I'll be working on blank verse here, and that means I'll put a free verse assignment up here shortly for you as well, so you can kind of play around with free verse and get your inner Whitman out. As for what I want to talk about today, I want to talk a bit about the kind of modernist poets who we're taking a look at. So let's go ahead and start with our dear old friend D.H. Lawrence. And D.H. Lawrence was mainly, he's kind of remembered mostly as a novelist, but he was also an essayist, he was also a painter, and he was a poet as well. And D.H. Lawrence was one of kind of the really high modernist figures. And one of the things he wrote a lot about was he wrote a lot about the dehumanizing and unfortunate aspects of industrialism and modern society. He thought that modern society was very much dangerous to humans and human psychology, and he had kind of a very, much like the Romantics before him, a kind of very intense longing for the historical state of things. And he was also very interested in childhood and family structures and relationships, as well as human sexuality and sexual exploration. He was a pretty interesting and bizarre guy. If you take a look at the poem I had you read, The Piano, which I will find here shortly. I'm trying to wait for my notes here to load up, but they're not seem to be coming along, unfortunately. So we might just have to go without them. But I think I'll actually probably bring up the list of the reading selections from last week so I can actually see those as we go. There's not really a lot of notes to take this week, just so you're kind of following along as we go through the poems, which should be ideal, I think, for this one. Okay, so D.H. Lawrence Piano. There's the, of course, the use of heroic couplets and the varying length and meter and things along those lines. But what you really get a sense of when you read this is the loss of kind of an innocence or a kind of childhood, or the loss of childhood memories and being kind of lost and alone in the world as an adult. You get that kind of sense that the cozy parlor's gone, that the Sunday evenings have kind of passed away. You get the sense that this is a memory that's very, very sharp, and it's something that he holds on to and goes back to when my manhood is cast down in a flood of remembrance. There's something about the inner child, and one of the things that was kind of happening during this time period is Freud was becoming much more popular. So the psychoanalytic theories were kind of coming into play. Freud's ideas of psychoanalysis, Jung was starting to come onto the scene, and these were kind of filtering their way into the work of the writers. And you can kind of see this idea of childhood connected to adulthood and the longing for childhood and childhood trauma extending into adulthood. You can get that sense that comes out of the piano here. And I think that Lawrence does a pretty good job of that. One of the things I think that Lawrence is remarkable for, even in his poetry but also in his writing, is he's extremely good at descriptions. Everything is very, very precise. That impressing the small, poised feet of a mother who smiles as she sings is a really kind of sharp, effective image, and he does a really good job with those, and his fiction contains those as well. As a matter of fact, one of the interesting things about his fiction, too, D.H. Lawrence, kind of when he passed away, it was generally agreed that he'd kind of wasted his life, partly because the books he'd written weren't wildly well accepted. As a matter of fact, Lady Chatterley's Lover actually was part of a really big censorship trial in the United Kingdom. So D.H. Lawrence was a really talented writer who really kind of gained more respect in a wider circles after he passed away, which is true of most of the writers I think we come across here. If we take a look now at Ezra Pound, Ezra Pound is a really kind of interesting and in some ways kind of tragic figure. he was kind of a big founder of the Imagist movement, and he was heavily influenced by Japanese and Chinese poetics. As a matter of fact, he was a real big fan of haiku, and one of his most famous poems, which I didn't actually have you read here in the Station of the Metro, but it's actually included here, has a kind of short, brief haiku quality. The image kind of punches you right in the face, which is what it's kind of meant to do. And I think that's really kind of one of the things that Pound was interested in. Later on in his life, though, Pound tended to write these extremely long, kind of epic rambling poems, and he moved away a bit from that Imagist movement, which is kind of what I tend to think he might be best at. There were also some other interesting things about Ezra Pound. Ezra Pound was a very complex person, not necessarily a good person. He was kind of a snob for the most part. He was anti-Semitic in a lot of ways, and he also fell in with Benito Mussolini when he was living in Europe. And after World War II, he was actually jailed for treason for a period of time, and then he ended up spending the rest of his life in a mental institution because they figured he wasn't actually safe to be he wasn't actually fit to stand trial. So he ended up kind of coming to a very unhappy end, which, again, a lot of poets do. So if you read Portrait d'une Femme, what this really is it's an analysis of a painting. It's a reflection in a painting. And it's kind of digging into just all of these different things that the kind of just the junk and the accretion of the things around the person. And one of the things that Pound was interested in was Pound was very much interested in capitalism and also industrialism and also consumer society. And you can kind of see that it comes at the end of the poem when he says, no, there is nothing in the whole and all, nothing that's quite your own, yet this is you. It's the idea that somehow people are defined by their possessions, but yet at the same time those don't have the ability to define them. And it's kind of an interesting poem in that regard. It's also kind of commenting on something that Ezra Pound had commented on earlier. So he kind of goes along and then he kind of goes short again, and then he gets to the cantos. And the cantos are a trip. That's probably the best way to describe them. I can't even say that I've read all the cantos. I actually had a friend in grad school who had taken an independent study to read all of the cantos under the guidance of an instructor. And the cantos is kind of the kitchen sink of poetry. If you actually read the little note here, up until line 67, it's actually a translation of the Odyssey. Then he kind of throws in the towel and just starts going off on all of these different weird historical and sociocultural explorations and kind of ramblings. And the cantos is really kind of interesting because it's a beautiful translation that stops at a certain point, and then he just kind of goes off the track. So at 67, and then he starts talking about Homer, he starts talking about translations, and then he kind of breaks off. And then you get to the next canto they present to us, and he's really ranting about usury, which I think is kind of an interesting topic, which also kind of ties into the anti-Semitism issue to some degree. But it's a really kind of very much just kind of this free thinking, freewheeling meditation on almost everything. Sometimes we talk about the idea of the encyclopedic novel, which is a novel that tries to just cover every single thing it possibly can. And I feel like with Pound we get the encyclopedic poem, which is a weird kind of beast in and of itself. So I think it's an interesting thing to take a look at, and just also to kind of see what happens to some degree when really strong poetic capability and really strong knowledge of history and illusion and literary illusion kind of come into play with someone who's probably not quite right in the head, which I think is kind of what you find in the cantos, and I think it's just kind of interesting. From there we move on to H.D., Hilda Doolittle. Hilda Doolittle was a really interesting figure. She was actually an Imagist. She knew Ezra Pound. She was a student of Freud. She was actually a patient of Freud later on in life because she was interested in Freud's theories. She was also openly bisexual, and that's actually one of the reasons that Freud was interested in her. And she was very unapologetically bisexual, and she was very much a supporter, and she very much was interested in women's rights and women's issues and women's sexuality. And she wrote very frankly about these things, which to some extent really kind of incensed a lot of people around her. And for quite some time, H.D. was not as well regarded as she could have been, but she's been picked up in recent years thanks to the rising interest in feminist criticism and feminist theory. But Helen, I think, is a really kind of interesting take on Helen of Troy. And if you take a look at it, All Greece hates the still eyes and the white face, the luster as of olives where she stands in the white hands. All Greece reviles the wan face when she smiles, hating it deeper still when it grows wan and white, remembering past enchantments and past ills. Greece sees unmoved God's daughter born of love, the beauty of cool feet and slenderest knees. Could love indeed the maid, only if she were laid white ash amid funeral cypresses. And I think it's very much... the poem is very much talking about the idea that the world, to some extent, hates beautiful women. It hates beautiful women because it can't have them, because of the way that they move through the world, that the way they capture people's imaginations. And Greece, to some extent, hates her because, if you ever read the Iliad, or if you know the Helen of Troy story, Helen of Troy was reportedly the reason for the Greek-Trojan War. So it's kind of for the Trojan War. So it's kind of interesting in a lot of different ways that she points out that this beauty becomes a hated thing because of the way it affects the world around it, and the way the woman affect the world, and the fact that she's wanted. And ultimately, you get the sense that it has very little to do with her. It has much more to do with the fact that the world in and of itself, she's kind of innocent in all of this, and this goes on around her, but yeah, they still hate her for it. And I think it's a really kind of interesting reflection. I think it also speaks to some extent to the problems that women face in society, and the troubles they face going forward and along those lines. So I think it's kind of an interesting piece in that regard. I think it's a good one in that way. T.S. Eliot is our next poet, and T.S. Eliot is a very... he's kind of considered one of the greats of modernism, and I think the reason for that is because his poems were very complex. They were very analytical. They were very difficult. And they were also highly stylized. It's very hard not to read T.S. Eliot and not know you're reading T.S. Eliot. I think the other reason T.S. Eliot is well respected as a modernist is because his work really kind of captures a modernist spirit to some extent. It takes a look at history in a way that kind of looks at how it's come to the state of the world today and how history plays into all of that. And I think he's really... it's really intelligent poetry. It's really well-educated poetry. And I think it's also kind of lovely and kind of haunting poetry as well, which I think is one of the reasons that Eliot tends to linger on. The Love Song of J. Alfred Prufrock is really an interesting, kind of fascinating, long meditation about the ways that the things we want in the world aren't the things we go for. It's about the ways we kind of live these quiet, unimpressive, unhappy lives when you want more from the world. And it's also, to some extent, if you read it, Prufrock is kind of a creep. He's kind of watching people more so than he interacts with the world, and it's kind of this observational character who has these kind of weird fascinations with women, but also has no way of connecting with them and no way of speaking out and no way of bonding with people. And it's... in many ways a very sad poem, but it's also in many ways kind of a very haunting poem because you also don't get the sense that Prufrock is someone who's wildly interesting or likable. And I think that that's one of the strengths of the Love Song of J. Alfred Prufrock is that Eliot's not apologetic about Prufrock. You feel sympathetic for him, but at the same time you also recognize that a lot of Prufrock's problems are Prufrock's fault. I think one of my favorite... lines in this, and I think that really kind of defines Prufrock as a character, is, shall I part my hair behind? Do I dare to eat a peach? I shall wear white flannel trousers and walk upon the beach. I hear the mermaids singing each to each. I do not think they will sing to me. And I think it's very much, to some extent too, the way we are self-defeating in our lives, the way we tend to think that because something's not going to happen to us, it's definitely not going to happen to us. And I think it's kind of very unfortunate and kind of very sad in a lot of ways. And I think that it's a really kind of strong poem, and I think it's one that I really like for that regard. But I think it's also got some really kind of haunting images. One of my favorite images in poetry is in this poem. For the yellow smoke that slides along the street, rubbing its back upon the window panes. I thought that was it's almost like a wolf moving through a city, is this kind of yellow smoke. And I think he's very kind of captivates the weird, strange qualities of cities and the people who live in them, and the weird, strange qualities of life. And I think that it kind of gives the sense of how a person sees the world and they don't feel like they quite fit in it. And I think that that's one of the kind of things that's strong about the poem. The Wasteland is a kind of classic one. I didn't have you read it because it's so heavily filled with allusions. As a matter of fact, there have been entire books written about the allusions in The Wasteland. So if it's something you ever want to take under your wing, it might be a fun little summer project for you, but if it's not, I can understand that as well. The Hollow Men, though, I think is a much more accessible poem. And The Hollow Men, I think, is very much a poem, and if you read it, about just the way that the world leaves people feeling empty, or the way the world is empty to some extent in the modern time. And one of the things to realize is that Eliot is writing this poem post-World War I. And we talked about last class, how World War I is this kind of tragic breaking moment for a lot of people. And it left this kind of sense of cultural malaise afterwards, in the sense of, what does any of this matter? And I think that The Hollow Men really kind of captures that, the idea that the world is such this complex moving machine, and we're all just kind of pieces and cogs within it, and that somehow makes us less human. It somehow makes us more hollow. It somehow makes our lives less meaningful. And I think that The Hollow Men is very much about that. And it kind of talks about, and I think this is also one of the most quoted poems in literature, because of the last two stanzas, or because of the last stanza itself. This is the way the world ends, this is the way the world ends, this is the way the world ends, not with a bang but with a whimper. And it really kind of suggests that the world is ending slowly and surely. It's not going to be a big violent war. It's just going to be a kind of everything falling apart, everything happening just kind of in a slow moving descent towards chaos. And I think it's kind of it's a haunting, sad poem in general. But I think it really kind of captures in a lot of ways the spirit of the way people felt in the wake of World War I, in the wake of all that loss, in the wake of all that death, and the fact that the world, that progress just seemed to march on, not really even paying attention to the dead. And I think it's a very kind of interesting reflection for that regard. Now, if we take a look at John Crowe Ransom, John Crowe Ransom was interesting because John Crowe Ransom is probably better known for his literary criticism. As a matter of fact, John Crowe Ransom was one of the founding figures for the New Critical School. And if you've taken 203 or 325 with Dr. Hodder, you would know that the new criticism is very much a shift from what old criticism used to be. And the old criticism used to be that if you knew everything about the poet, you knew their background, you knew their history, you'd read their notes, then you could comment on and understand their poems. It was very much an understanding of the poet and interpreting the poetry along those lines. The new critics argued that no, the poem is a self-contained thing independent of the author. It stands alone. The poem should be accessible and interpretable on its own. And I think that one of the things that's interesting about John Crowe Ransom's Bells for John Whiteside's Daughter is it really kind of it's poetry that's almost to some extent driven by the criticism. The poems that John Crowe Ransom write, especially things like this, they could be set in any time. They could be about any area. There's not a really kind of focused, centralized, specific historical quality to them. They're very much poems that are meant to be timeless, that are meant to be accessible over and over again because of the idea that they're capturing something that's true about the human heart and human experience over generations and throughout time. And this one, of course, is kind of talking about death, which I think is something that it's very much discussing death, which is a cultural consistent throughout the entirety of history, and will continue to be a cultural consistent through the entirety of history, unless for some reason we figure out a way to get around it. We'll leave that to Ray Kurzweil. But for the most part, it's a very kind of sharp reflection, and it's very much, if you read through it, there's nothing here that really locates us to a particular time, period, place, person. And I think that a lot of that really kind of, aside from the fact it's for John Whiteside's Daughter, but also, again, that's a kind of really focused, limited, that could be very universal almost as well, within Western culture at the very least. So I think a lot of, to some extent, it kind of is poetry that reflects the criticism of it, which I think, the criticism that Ransom believed in, which I think is kind of interesting. Archibald MacLeish is a really kind of interesting character as well. He was actually a Librarian of Congress. He was actually the head of the Library of Congress for a while, and he was also the person who was responsible for creating the idea of a poet laureate of the United States. And he had very strong opinions on poetry, as you can kind of see from Ars Poetica, and given the fact that he was one of the creators of the idea of the poet laureate, and who part of his job was judging poetry, I think it's very apropos that the poem we read from MacLeish is the poem that he writes about what poetry is. And I think if you read through the poem, it's got some beautiful imagery, and it's got some very kind of just cool, effective, well put together lines. But I think the one that really kind of stands out to me is a poem should not mean but be. And I think that that's something that I've tried to impart to you throughout the class. And when I give poetic feedback and commentary, is that your poem should really recreate the experience of the actual thing itself, as opposed to be a representation of the experience. ideally poetry comes as close to the experience itself as it possibly can, as opposed to simply commenting or reflecting on the experience. So I think that's something I've tried to convey to you folks, and I think it's kind of an important thing to take a look at here. So I think the idea of a poem should not mean but be, I think, is kind of a sharp one, and I think that it is very telling, and I think it's also a very strong idea to carry with you if you are in fact a poet, and think about how your poems are aiming for that in your work. Edna St. Vincent Millay was a feminist poet. She was very active in feminist movements and feminist organizations, and she was a really brilliant writer of sonnets. A lot of her work is sonnets, and the fact that the poems we read here are both sonnets. And she wrote some very kind of sharp sonnets, but as opposed to other sonnets, which tend to be the sonnets we read in the past, which tend to be very accessible, her sonnets are very kind of complex and abstracted, and they're kind of interesting in that regard. If you take a look at Euclid Alone Has Looked on Bare Beauty, it's very much a reflection on abstract concepts and abstract interpretations of the world, of how they're seen by someone who studies geometry, and understanding these wild patterns in the world, and giving those and understanding those kind of effective ways. I think it's kind of an interesting thing to take a look at. And Euclid was, of course, the first geometer, is that the term? The mathematician who basically invented geometry, and he kind of, his view of the world, I think, is what she's looking at here, and the way he kind of viewed world in terms of geometric terms, which are absolute and mathematical and precise. And I think that's kind of an interesting way of kind of looking at how someone sees the world in kind of a sonnet. And I Dreamed I Moved Among the Elysian Fields is the same type of thing. And this one I think is more traditional as sonnets go, and it almost feels more like it would belong or calls back to the Romantic period. And if you take a look at it, it's kind of lovely at the end. All these mortal women, yet all these above the ground had a God for guest. Freely I walked beside them at ease, addressing them, by them again addressed, and marveled nothing, for remembering you, wherever I was among them, well I knew. It's almost the saying, I too have walked with a God, and that God was you. And I think it's kind of a beautiful reflection on kind of a dreamlike quality, but also of saying that it's a wonderful compliment to someone that walking with you is the same as hosting or having been host to a god. I think it's kind of a lovely piece, despite the fact, the creepy part that Zeus tended to rape people. I don't think that's necessarily what she's talking about here. I could be wrong. You don't know, but it does seem to be that there's a kind of fondness for the person, or a love for the person here, more so than anything else. So let's get to Wilfred Owen. And Wilfred Owen, kind of a sharp move from I Dreamed Among the Elysian Fields to Anthem for Doomed Youth, even in titles alone. But Wilfred Owen is actually a really kind of sad case in poetry, more so than Pound, more so than any of the other poets, because Wilfred Owen was really a talented, brilliant, effective poet who did an amazing job of chronicling warfare and writing about warfare. And unfortunately, he was killed 1 week before the end of World War I. And it's unfortunate because he wrote heavily about just the way warfare was dehumanizing and demoralizing and nightmarish. And it almost takes a lot of the writing we talked about with Romantics, the idea that warfare was noble and courageous, and it gave the human spirit a chance to rise above and be brave. And Owen cuts that down entirely, because the war that Owen is seeing is really a very different kind of war. It's the war of mechanization. It's trench warfare. And trench warfare, for those of you who never really studied World War I or World War II, was ugly and nasty. It was horrible. It wasn't people charging each other in a field. It was people blowing each other up at a distance, gassing one another, and when there was trench warfare, it was hand-to-hand combat for the most part with knives, and the guns just kind of went out the window, and it was people stabbing each other in holes in the ground. It was a real nightmare. And it was also mechanized warfare, so there was more killing in World War I than there had been in a lot of other historical times. One of the things that happened after World War I and World War II is there were massive issues with population, because so many men had been killed in war. And I think Anthem for a Doomed Youth really kind of captures that. And there's a real kind of, he starts off with a shot at the, if you take a look at the note here, the poems of today, this book is which he possessed, it's and it's very much kind of an idea to the music of Pan's flute was vile, and the bugle call of endeavor, the passing bells of death. It's just a romantic kind of epigraph, and what he starts with is, what passing bells for these who die as cattle? Where's the romance for these people? Where's the honor for these people who died just being slaughtered in fields? And there's a really, and it really kind of points out that there's no beauty in this. There's no greater meaning. There's no bravery. There's no honor here. This is just murder on a large scale. And it's haunting and beautiful, but it really did a great job, kind of the same way that the televisation of the Vietnam War really stirred up anti-war sympathy. This is really a time where Owen really just pointed out war is an awful, terrible thing, and it does not improve, it does not get better. And if you take a look at Futility, it really kind of, it's not directly about war per se. It has some more elements in it, such as the fact he woke up in France, and the idea of anything might rouse him now, but it's really kind of reflecting on just what is the point of all this if all we're going to do is die and ruin it and hurt one another. And it really kind of talks about, why does the world keep moving on if this is how it goes. It's kind of a really kind of sad reflection by the poet, and I think Futility is kind of what he felt about war in general, and what he kind of felt about societies that create wars. It's just a futile thing. What are we doing? What is the point of this? Why are we even bothering with this? And I think it's kind of a touching and effective piece overall. E. Cummings, next to Course of God, America, and I, and Somewhere I've Never Traveled Gladly Beyond. E. Cummings, of course, is famous for his punctuation and his lack of punctuation, and also the way I think he flows words into one another. The lack of punctuation kind of creates a stream of consciousness, almost meditative quality to his work, where things are not necessarily emphasized or stood out, but he also has noises and sounds that are kind of onomatopoeia mixed in on a regular basis. Though despite the fact, to some extent, his forms, as they did point out, they're kind of similar, because he does write in sonnet structures quite often. But the way he writes within a line is very, very different from most sonnets. Kind of to some extent the way Millay does when she makes really kind of abstract sonnets. Cummings does something a little bit different, where he kind of creates these strange, haunting kind of sonnets that just kind of everything flows together, and it's very stream of consciousness. It doesn't feel like it's heavily wrought. It feels like it's almost created on spur, which probably was not the case. I will say something about E. E. Cummings. Be very, very careful if you're going to try and emulate E. E. Cummings, because it's very hard to emulate a particular style, especially one as particular as E. E. Cummings. And if you decide you don't want to punctuate your poems, there's a pretty good chance, unless you are doing it at an E. E. Cummings level of quality, I'm going to say put some punctuation in there, all right? So, and there's a pretty good chance most readers are too. So, next to, of course, God, America, and I think it's a really kind of interesting poem, where a man, it's about just someone kind of, someone's rant about America and patriotism and jingoism and war and things along those lines. It's a kind of lovely piece that just kind of, it's almost like you're listening to your old grandpa fire out a sonnet about how terrible everything is and how things don't work the way they used to and things along those lines. So I think it's kind of a fun piece in that regard. And Somewhere I've Traveled Never Gladly Beyond is really kind of in many ways kind of a beautiful romantic structure written in this kind of stream of consciousness style. It's not as finely wrought, but it almost feels like someone's kind of ardor just flowing out of them. And I think that that's got a lovely quality to it. And just these little things that he notices about this person, such as nobody, not even the rain, has such small hands, and the idea of such a gentle touch and things along those lines associated with it. I think it's kind of a lovely poem for that regard, but I think that the stream of consciousness quality of E. Cummings, that he kind of achieves this punctuation and his onomatopoeia and things along those lines, is kind of interesting and worth taking a look at. And I think it kind of opens up some ideas of what else you could do with your poem. Robert Graves is an English poet. He was kind of in many ways fairly traditional. He reminds me a lot of Yeats, more so than the moderns poets such as an Eliot or a Pound or a William Carlos Williams. But I think War Nature Children is a kind of interesting poem, in as much as it kind of has a very kind of abstract idea to it, that if you think that the world is this perfect place, that's everything is unique and everything is special, you have to realize that all of this is repeated before, all of this is within some other thing, all of this is kind of just flows throughout and throughout, and everyone thinks their world is special to some extent. And I think it kind of points out that the way we tend to think of our world is the world being there for you is not so much the case as so much as you are part of someone else's world and your world is part of someone else's world and things along those lines. So I think it's kind of an interesting reflection on that regard. And it's not necessarily the happiest poem, but it does have kind of a quality of didacticism to it, which I think find in a lot of Robert Gray's poems, a bit less so in Yeats. But I think it's an interesting piece. Hart Crane. Hart Crane actually is... he was well respected in his time. He was kind of lost and not paid as much attention to through kind of the middle part of the 20th century. And then he was kind of picked up again, and people started to realize kind of how brilliant his poetry actually was, how really kind of, in many ways, whereas Eliot was an American who became a British expatriate, in some ways people would say that Crane was actually America's Eliot, in the sense that his poems, a lot like Eliot's, are very complex. They're very... difficult, they're not easily accessible, and they also tend to have these kind of rich, deep ideas to them. And I think that the Bridge, which I think is the poem I had you read, really is an interesting piece because it captures so much about the world in just talking about the Brooklyn Bridge. And he takes the Brooklyn Bridge and he starts expanding all these ideas out of it and kind of taking all these things out of it and kind of tying it to the city and tying it to the city's history and just blowing all of these things out of the bridge. And I think it's a really kind of interesting way. It's almost similar to what Eliot does with The Wasteland, taking all these illusions and kind of pulling meaning out of them. And I think he does the same thing with The Bridge. And it's kind of much in the line of Pound. It's much in the line of Eliot. And it's an interesting piece. Against the traffic lights that skim thy swift, unfractioned idiom, immaculate sigh of stars bending thy path, condense eternity, and we have seen night lifted in thine arms. I mean, beautiful writing, too, for the most part. He's a real kind of strong stylist with sharp images, and his words kind of resonate very, very effectively. But he also has this kind of everything in the kitchen sink quality that you get with Pound and Eliot, but maybe on a little bit lesser scale. So I think Hart Crane is definitely worth taking a look at, and his work is solid. Langston Hughes is the last one we come to, and I'll be entirely honest, I love the work of Langston Hughes. Langston Hughes, his poetry is eminently accessible, but also extremely brilliant, and also very much part of a really kind of rich historical tradition that respects and honors African American musical traditions and oral traditions and historical traditions, but at the same time also recognizes the idea that there is the future and that things change, and that it's very much taking, it's meeting two worlds of kind of Western literary poetic tradition and bringing African American musical and oral traditions and poetic traditions into play and kind of putting them all together in this really kind of fascinating, beautiful pieces. And he's a very amazing poet, and he has all these kind of beautiful elements in his work. And I think his poems tend to be pretty succinct for the most part, but I think for the most part they're really sharp and they're really effective. The Negro Speaks of Rivers is such a beautiful kind of sweeping poem. I've known rivers ancient as the world and older than the flow of human blood and human vein. My soul has grown deep like rivers. And he uses repetition in a really kind of effective way, almost like a preacher does. And I think it's kind of strong and it makes it very powerful. And I think it's a kind of a brilliant poem, and it has a kind of just sweeping, powerful quality to it, like a lot of his work does. And I think The Negro Speaks of Rivers is a great one for that. Harlem, I think, is a really fantastic poem, and Harlem, in so many ways, kind of became an anthem for the civil rights movement and also interest in civil rights. That idea of what happens to a dream deferred, and the dream deferred, of course, is equality, is what he's talking about here. And what happens to that dream if it's deferred? Does it dry up? Does it die? Does it go away? Does it rot? Does it just kind of fall apart and sag? Or does it blow up? And I think, or does it explode? It's very kind of telling, and I think very effective, because in some ways it's very much tied to the civil rights movement. It's a kind of brilliant exploration of what the civil rights movement actually was. It was an explosion of people just being tired of being mistreated. And I think that the idea that the dream deferred, that we'll wait, that we'll hold off, that it's okay, we can keep going, we can keep waiting. And Hughes says, no, it's going to blow up. And it did blow up ultimately, and that's what the civil rights movement really was. And it's a brilliant, I think, a very, very effective piece that kind of talks about, and especially in Harlem when these people are living in New York City in the midst of all this wealth and all this power, but also having no access to it, despite through anything other than art and their ability to impress white people, I think is a very kind of strong statement about how the civil rights movement actually happened. And it almost reminds me a lot of James Baldwin's book, The Fire Next Time, which talks about just the way that the civil rights movement is ultimately a peaceful movement and should be a peaceful movement, but it's founded in a very deep anger and founded in a very deep resentment of the way people have been treated, and I think that Harlem really captures that quite effectively. So I think they're really strong poems for this week, and a lot of them are poems that really kind of resonate with me. So I hope you enjoyed them as much as I did. You know your assignment for the week, so go ahead and get to it. In the meantime, if you have any questions or concerns, let me know. Otherwise, take care, be well, and I will talk to you folks again in about 7 days.